Essay number 25, John and Susan. It's been the plan all along, the call on every life. We are created beings with the capacity to hold God. Amber Haynes. One weekend, I went back to Missouri and Arkansas to visit family and friends. The boys came along on their first big boy plane ride, a few hours across the South and Midwest, licking orange and yellow lollipops and coloring. After a few days in Missouri with my family, I borrowed my sister's car and headed through the Ozark Mountains back to Fayetteville, where we had started our family a few years before. We drove straight to Susan's house, our former neighbor and great-grandma to the boys in every sense but actual blood. She had taken Elliot on walks while I was pregnant with Isaiah, spent the mornings examining trees and digging up worms and socializing with all the other neighbors while I rested on the couch and journaled. After Isaiah was born, she began walking the two of them along with her friend Ruth and the two girls she cared for like a grandmother, a little parade marching through our tiny neighborhood. And every time we go back now, there is no one else they would want to see but Susan, because my boys' Fayetteville world is summed up in Susan's backyard garden, in the tomato plant out front and the crocuses that line the drive, in eating popsicles and being spoiled by love and good food and movies and digging in every spot of mud available. So I left the boys with Susan for an entire day and headed to Onyx Coffee Lab, the coffee shop and roaster where Travis had worked as a barista. I ordered my latte and nestled into the back bench. It was like my whole being was laid wide open, ready to receive an entire day to rest and hear and know the presence of God in my midst. Not long after, John walked in the door, this man that I'd always wanted more time with before we moved, a local pastor and community advocate. He is a father figure if ever there was one. I stood up and hugged him and felt the tension in my shoulders slacken under the weight of his pastoring love. We had a short 10-minute conversation before he left to go cycling with a friend. It was the quickest conversation I had that entire weekend, but those few minutes filled me and sparked life in me and sent me off to find more of God, sent me on a search for new spaces inside myself. I told John about my dad leaving when I was young, something I wouldn't usually bring up after 2 minutes with someone. We talked about church and immediately walked into the heaviness of what it means to love people and be inclusive, what it means to ask questions and challenge others to walk more deeply with the mystery of God. When our conversation abruptly ended, I settled back into the booth. I could see in the eyes of the stranger across from me that something had come to life in her. Even in listening to a quick conversation between two friends, she understood something of God, something of community and human connection and companionship, all sacred and holy. I spent all 3 mornings of our trip in that coffee shop, watching the front door open and close, watching it bring in old friends that I hadn't seen in a year or 2. John and the other friends who came after him were balm to me, slight whispers to keep going, to keep processing and enduring, living a life called to wholeness and all glorious things. All the while, across town, my boys were with Susan, learning the exact same thing. The prayer. Oh God, thank you for quiet conversations over coffee cups and mugs of tea, for memories and new stories, reminders that you find us and we find you when we look into each other's eyes. Thank you for these spaces. We know that they are sacred because they give us room to breathe, to remember who we are, to ask who we should be. Thank you that you honor all of it, all of us, all of these realms that you call holy. Amen.